phone's down, you're not holding it. Great. Tell me where you're from. Oh, sorry, your name, where you're from, and what you do.
My name is Robles. I own a website called antiqueguns.com, and I'm a dealer in antique firearms and militaria from the 17 and 1800s. I currently reside in Utah, central Utah, about an hour south of Salt Lake.
Fantastic. So tell me about your history when it comes to firearms. When did you start getting interested in it, and when did you realize it was going to play a larger role in your life?
Well, unlike a lot of people that are into this, I did not grow up with firearms in my home. It wasn't until I got in the business world, though I was in my 20s, and more so than firearms, I was more interested in the history of the Old West and in the Civil War. And it became real clear, and I had a real detailed interest, because what I used to do is go to, read old newspapers and go to a library called the Bancroft Library that's in the University of California. And it's a library that only has original documents, so you can't check anything out. You can just read things that were there, but they were written back in the 1800s. And I was really fascinated by this, but it became real clear that I couldn't understand life in the 1800s unless I understood firearms, because they were so important to people's life.
Right, and tell me about your job responsibilities, how long you've been doing it, and what do you do on a day-to-day basis?
Well, I had a real job here, let's say 15 to 20 years ago. I sold real estate in Northern California. I took this up more as a hobby at first, and it eventually became a full-time passion as the internet unfolded. And I own the company called antiqueguns.com, and I basically go to major shows, auction houses, buy and sell antique firearms of that era from the, like I say, 17 to 1800s, and my business is that I sell them all over the world. The fascinating part about this, these are really neat old things that you can't go into any antique store and find. You have to really look for these things to find them. So that's kind of what's happened, and I kind of view my job as like being a professional treasure hunter, because there's always that deal out there where there's a big hit to be made, and it's very exciting when I find something like that.
Great, and then if you would say something like, I've sold, thousands of guns throughout my career, I sold, 200 last week, or, something like that.
Okay. Well, to give you an idea, in a typical month I sell somewhere between 300 to 400 antique firearms, about 50% of which I ship overseas. I've sold and looked at tens of thousands. I may look at 100,000 firearms in the course of the year to buy what I buy. And so as a result of that, I feel I've got a very extensive knowledge on these guns, because I look at so cotton picking many of them.
Great. Was there a specific firearm that sparked your passion for antique guns?
Well, back in the 1800s, if you really think about this, warfare has driven the advancement of men throughout all time. In that, because of necessity, those armies or those countries that could create an advantage for themselves with better tactics and better weapons could wind up taking over their neighbors. And this goes back to the time of the Romans. As a result of that, I've always been fascinated with weapons that were in that era, that were that important to history. The first one would have been, in the Americas, would have been the American Kentucky rifle, because during the Revolutionary War it gave such an enormous advantage to the colonials. During the Civil War, it probably would have been the Henry rifle, because it was, again, a complete revolution in what firearms could do. And as a result of that, I guess if I have two favorites, I would have to say those are the favorites.
Great. And then if you could break down the specs of those two firearms, what are they made out of? What ammunition does it take? Feet per second? How do you load it? What are the mechanisms that make it fire? Tell me about the specs. All
right. Well, the Kentucky rifle, long rifle, you have to understand the history of the world back then. When the English came from Europe, the average soldier never grew up with firearms, never fired a firearm before he was in the military. They were terrible shots, and basically they fired smoothbore muskets. And the way warfare worked is that you had to have cannons shoot over the armies to get the armies close together. And people think the armies lined up is what slaughtered the soldiers, and that wasn't it at all. It was after they'd fire their rounds was the bayonet charge, which soldiers were the best with the bayonets. What the American Kentucky rifle allowed is suddenly Americans could, rather than sit 20, 30 yards away from the enemy, they could sit back 200 or 300 yards and plink these guys off just basically as fast as they could load their guns. And this was devastating to the English troops because they frankly could never get within range where they could use their tactics against the Americans. And singly, it's probably the most important reason why the colonials were able to defeat the British, in that they would so destroy them. Now, typically, the firearms being used during the Civil War as man-killer calibers were in the 40 to 50 caliber range. The barrel lengths were long, usually 42 to 46 inches, because the longer the barrel, the more accurate the gun tended to be. At that time, they only had a round ball, and they would paper patch the ball so that it would fit tight in the grooves and they could be reasonably accurate. It wasn't until about 50 years later, before the Civil War, that the mini ball came out, and then which also was an additional advantage to World War or to war tactics. Do you want me to go on about the Henry?
Yes, absolutely. And if you could break down the specs of it, so again, you know, what's it made out of, what ammunition it takes, and the feet per second, those sorts of things.
Okay. Well, the Kentucky style rifle basically would fire a lead ball with black powder ammunition. Again, 40 to 50 caliber. The feet per second, you know, to tell you the truth, I don't know. It was relatively slow by today's standards. I think it was somewhere in the 900 to 1,000 feet per second. They were accurate up to about 300 yards, but that would have been the extent of how accurate they were. Now, by the time the Civil War came around, obviously that weapon was old hat, and the Henry rifle was developed by Oliver Winchester and a guy by the name of Tyler Henry. And let me give you a little story about that, on why that was so effective. Early in the war, three Union soldiers came upon a company, which is about 100 Confederate soldiers that were bivouacked at a camp. The Union soldiers sent back to their troops one of the three and told them, hey, go tell the army we've got a Confederate camp here. And then the other two guys, both armed with Henry rifles, got in their positions and began to fire upon the company. Now, you got to understand, they are outnumbered 100 Confederates to 2 Union soldiers. But both Union soldiers had Henry rifles. Well, suddenly there were rifle shots coming from everywhere, and the Confederates ducked down and took cover because they thought they were being attacked by another company. And as it played out over the course of a day, because it took a day to get the reinforcements on the Union side to come in, the Union soldiers were able to kill almost 40 of the Confederate soldiers. Every time someone would poke his head up, they'd shoot it. Well, at the end of the day, when finally a company showed up and they took the Confederates into captivity, the Confederates were aghast to realize that their 100 soldiers had been captured by 2 Union Army soldiers armed with Henry rifles. And that's the kind of firepower those things offered in relation to what the typical single-shot bullet was during the day. So it just revolutionized the war process.
Great. Do you consider yourself to have more knowledge than the average gun enthusiast, and if so, why?
Yeah, I feel I have considerably more than the average person that walks through any antique arms show, and probably 95% or more of the dealers, simply because this is a full-time business for me. It's a passion. It's how I make 100% of my living, and I travel all over the country to look at these weapons. It's not just knowing the weapons, but knowing the finishes that are on the weapons, knowing how they were originally made, so that you can identify which is an original weapon, which is one that has been altered. Antique weapons are like coins, and the better the condition, the more they bring. And so a fine condition antique gun may sell for 10 times what a poorly conditioned antique firearm will. But the key is to make sure you've seen one that's original and not one that's been re-blued, refinished, sanded, or altered, because that doesn't help the value, that hurts the value, if anything. So since I have a lot of experience with that, yeah, I think I've got much more knowledge than most anybody you're going to probably find.
Great. And do you have any teaching or instructing experience when it comes to firearms?
I don't have any instructing experience regarding firearms. I've done a little bit of that back in my sales career. I was a sales trainer for a company I used to work for, an investment real estate firm, but not in firearms.
Okay. And I think you already answered this. What is your absolute all-time favorite firearm and why?
Well, you know, I would have to, those two that I just mentioned to you, the Kentucky long rifle, those guns, in addition to be revolutionary a revolutionary advancement, are also a work of art. You have to remember, back in the late 1700s, early 1800s, the average person thinks, oh, fine American furniture was where the craftsmen were. And that's not the case. Everybody had to own a firearm in America. If you were going to live on the frontier, you had to have a willingness to risk your life in order to acquire, land and property, and you had to be capable with a firearm to kill game and to protect yourself and your family. So those guns were very, very important. Everyone had to have one, and not just one, usually many. And as a result of that, the best craftsmen, the best wood carvers, the best metallurgists tended to work in the antique firearms trade because the market for those things was so strong. You would get some of these guns that were made in the late 1700s that today are selling for $100,000 to $300,000, of which the average American doesn't. It's been so long ago, they don't really realize how valued and treasured certain guns from certain locations are.
Have you ever built a gun, or do you do any gunsmithing?
No, I'm not a gunsmith, and I don't really work the guns. I would say what you'd call me really is a very serious firearms investor, okay, and dealer. And, that's probably a little different than what the average guy you're contacting for this would be. But that's my specialty. And it's a fairly, you'd be surprised at how many people deal in old antique firearms this way. In fact, I would say of the tens of thousands of antique firearms I've owned, I've probably only fired half a dozen of them over the course of time. Certain guns we fire just to go out and play around with. I have my modern guns when I go out to shoot guns that I want to shoot, because I don't want to go out and take an expensive, Winchester model 1866 and risk blowing it up, since I can shoot a less expensive gun and not have to worry about that.
All right, fantastic. What's your absolute favorite thing about a firearm, and what does it mean to you?
Well, I guess I would have to say my favorite thing about the firearms is really what drove me to get into this business to begin with. In that, you have to understand, when our ancestors were coming from Europe, I had ancestors come from Spain and some from Northern Europe, they came to the Americas with a dream, an American dream. And that dream was that they could go out and, for the first time in their lives, own land, own property, and be an entrepreneur and work for themselves. But they couldn't do it unless they were accomplished with a firearm. And that is the point that a lot of Americans today have lost. All these people that moved west, it wasn't a choice they made. They had to be good with their firearms. The young boys had to be able to shoot. And, the old story is that a father would give his son, 3 cartridges or 3 bullets in the day, and he was expected to bring back three pieces of game at the end of every night. Young boys in the, from 8 to 12, that's how they spent their entire day, was out hunting so that their family would have meat that night at the dinner table. And because it's such an important part of the American lifestyle, which is unlike literally any other lifestyle with only the exception of Australia, no other country has been settled for the most part in the last 200 years by people that had to go through that.
All right, fantastic. And I guess I've never been if I didn't ask you this, but what's like in the antique arms world, what's like a golden nugget that everyone's trying to find, or what's like one of the elusive guns that every antique gun dealer would love to get their hands on? Well,
there are a million different. There are all sorts of them, and it depends on some of them that are worth a lot more than you may think. Let me give you one little story of how I got one. I set up at a show in Reno, and I had a fellow call me, and he had an elderly woman, apparently, I never met her, her brother had passed away and left a couple of antique firearms in a closet underneath a stairway. They called me and told me that they were looking to sell these guns, or they were going to give them to the police department and have them destroyed because she didn't like guns. So I looked at the picture real quickly, and they told me the price they wanted for them. And I saw immediately, either they were spectacular reproductions or they were in immaculate condition. So I flew out there the next day, talked to her, I believe she was in Seattle, flew out the next day, and they had a model 1866 Winchester carbine and a Colt single action artillery model in a .45 caliber. And I looked at them, and sure enough, they were real guns. And they told me the price they wanted. I negotiated with them a little bit, and I paid them about $11,000 for the guns. Well, as it turned out, I brought the guns home, realized the condition of the Winchester was as fine as one as I'd ever seen. I turned around and sold that gun for $40,000, you know, within a few weeks, and the artillery I sold for about $8,000. So they gave me a price, but there was an opportunity where